In the gray cradle of the Carpathian foothills, where the year 1847 bled into winter like ink dissolving in still water, a birth occurred that would quietly unmake the foundations of a name long thought immovable. The manor of the Krasnov line rose from the slate slopes as though it had been quarried from the mountain's own reluctance, its towers' blunt fingers pressed against a sky that never quite cleared. Lord Victor Krasnov, inheritor of timber rights and ancient tax privileges, had waited through 12 barren years of marriage for an heir who might carry the weight of his ledgers and his pride into another century. When the midwife's hands finally lifted a living child from the blood and steam of the birthing chamber, the cry that followed was thin, almost courteous, as though the infant already understood the necessity of discretion. Anna, the lady whose face had grown sharp with waiting, wept without sound. Victor, standing at the threshold with the physician's report still warm in his hand, felt something colder than relief settle behind his ribs. The suspicion, formless at first, that the timing of this conception had aligned too neatly with the months he had spent negotiating trade concessions in the distant capital, leaving the manor to the slow turning of its own clocks and the company of a single traveling scholar who had sought shelter from an early blizzard. The christening was performed under a low gray sky, the village priest's voice steady as he poured water across the small forehead and pronounced the name Stefan, a name chosen from the family register to suggest unbroken descent. Peasants gathered at the gates with offerings of smoked meat and woven cloth, murmuring blessings that sounded rehearsed. Victor accepted their deference with the practiced nod of a man who had always known his place in the order of things. Yet that night, alone in the long gallery where portraits of ancestors stared down with identical eyes, he found himself measuring the distance between the cradle and the family tree etched in vellum. The doubt did not scream. It simply refused to leave the room. It sat with him through the small hours, polite, patient, suggesting that legitimacy was not a fact of flesh, but a consensus, and that consensus could be withdrawn without announcement. In the years that followed, the household arranged itself around the child with the meticulous care of people building a bridge across a crevasse they pretended not to see. Anna devoted herself to the boy's every breath, teaching him the names of the mountain flowers before he could walk, singing lullabies whose melodies she had learned from her own mother, as though repetition could make the song true. Servants learned to speak of Stefan only in approved tones. Healthy, quick of mind, the future Krasnov. The tutor hired from Lviv arrived with letters of recommendation and a trunk of Latin grammars. He soon understood that his role was not merely instruction, but the daily performance of certainty. Victor, meanwhile, immersed himself in the ledgers, the timber contracts, the correspondence with imperial clerks, constructing an edifice of busyness so dense that no idle moment could admit the quiet question that had taken residence behind his eyes. By the time Stefan could speak in full sentences, the manor had settled into a rhythm that felt almost sacred in its predictability. Mornings began with the boy at his mother's, knee reciting verses from the family prayer book. Afternoons found him in the stable yard, learning the names of the horses, his small hands tracing the brands that marked them as Krasnov property. Evenings ended with Victor reading aloud from histories of the region, his voice measured, his gaze never quite meeting the child's. The servants moved through these hours like figures in a painting, their expressions carefully neutral, their conversations limited to weather and harvest. No one remarked that the master sometimes paused at the nursery door and then continued down the corridor without entering. No one mentioned that the lady's laughter had acquired a brittle edge, as though each note required effort to keep from cracking. The mountain itself seemed complicit, its mists rolling in at dusk to blur the edges of the estate until the stone walls appeared to float, untethered from the rock beneath them. As Stefan passed his 7th year, the doubt inside Victor began to change shape. It was no longer a single suspicion, but a slow, philosophical seepage, staining every thought it touched. He would stand at the library window, watching the boy run across the frost-hardened lawn and feel the ground tilt beneath his own feet. What, after all, Was blood, if not a convenient fiction agreed upon by the living to comfort themselves against the indifferent arithmetic of generations? Every ancestor in the gallery had once been an infant whose claim to the name rested on the word of a father who might have harbored the same private hesitation. The realization brought no rage, only a deepening calm that felt like the approach of winter. Victor began to keep a private journal, not of events, but of absences. The number of times he had looked at Stefan and felt nothing that could be named affection, the precise quality of the silence that followed every paternal gesture. He wrote in a code of his own devising, small marks that would mean nothing to any other eye, yet to him they formed a ledger of erosion. Anna, sensing the shift without being able to name it, responded with ever more elaborate rituals of motherhood. She commissioned a portrait of the boy alone, seated in the great chair that had belonged to Victor's grandfather. The painter instructed to emphasize the line of the jaw that might, with generous light, recall the Krasnov profile. When the canvas arrived, she hung it in the dining hall where it could be seen from every seat, a declaration rendered in oil and varnish. Stefan sat for the sittings with perfect stillness, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the painter's shoulder, as though he understood that the image being created was not of him, but of the idea he was required to embody. The finished work pleased Anna. Victor studied it for long minutes, and then turned away without comment. The doubt now so thoroughly woven into his perception that the painted face seemed to gaze back with gentle mockery. The tutor, a quiet man named Merrick with ink-stained cuffs and a habit of quoting forgotten Stoics, began to notice the architecture of avoidance. He adjusted his lessons accordingly, teaching Stefan the histories of empires that had collapsed under the weight of their own myths, the philosophies that questioned whether the self was anything more than a story told to the mirror. Stefan absorbed these ideas with a gravity unusual in a child, repeating phrases about the provisional nature of identity in a voice that carried no accusation, yet somehow filled the schoolroom with a pressure the tutor could feel against his skin. Merrick never spoke of these lessons to the master. He understood that his continued employment depended on the maintenance of surfaces. By Stefan's 10th year, the village had begun to sense the wrongness without being able to locate its source. Farmers who brought grain to the manor mills spoke in lowered voices of the boy who moved through the world as though he were already halfway elsewhere. Women at the market remarked on the lady's pallor, the way her smiles arrived a moment too late. The priest, during his quarterly visits, offered extra blessings and left with the uneasy feeling that the holy water had touched something already dissolving. None of these observations rose to the level of gossip. They remained suspended in the mountain air like mist, visible only from a distance. Inside the manor, the pressure continued its patient work. Victor found himself unable to sit at the same table as the boy for entire meals, inventing sudden business in the timber yards or urgent letters that required immediate reply. Anna compensated by speaking for both of them, her conversation a bright screen stretched across the emptiness. Stefan ate in silence, his posture perfect, his eyes lowered to the plate as though the food itself might offer some clue to the rules of the house he inhabited. At night, the boy sometimes walked the long corridors in his nightshirt, pausing before the portraits, studying faces that refused to recognize him in return. The servants who glimpsed these nocturnal journeys crossed themselves and hurried past, unwilling to acknowledge what they had seen. When Stefan turned 14, the doubt inside Victor achieved a new clarity. It was no longer about the circumstances of conception. It had become a meditation on the nature of reality itself. If one child could be accepted while another, under different conditions, might have been denied, then the entire structure of inheritance, of name, of belonging, rested on nothing firmer than collective agreement. And if agreement could be withheld, what prevented it from being withheld from Victor himself? The thought arrived during a storm that shook the towers and sent slates clattering into the courtyard. He stood at the window watching lightning illuminate the forests and understood, with the calm of a man reading his own sentence, that he had spent his life defending a position that had never truly existed. The realization did not free him. It simply removed the last illusion that freedom was possible. Anna's health began its slow decline shortly afterward, a wasting that the physicians could neither name nor arrest. She spent days in the blue salon, staring at the portrait of Stefan, her fingers tracing the painted jawline as though touch could confirm what words no longer could. Stefan, now tall and quiet, read to her from volumes of poetry that spoke of exile and the beauty of things that pass. His voice was steady, almost tender, yet Anna sometimes wept without knowing why, as though the verses describe a loss she had not yet been permitted to name. Victor, watching from doorways, felt the pressure condense into something almost physical, a weight behind the sternum that made breathing an act of will. He began to destroy documents in the small hours. Letters from his youth, marriage contracts, pages from the family Bible where names had been inscribed in fading ink. He fed them to the fire one by one, watching the flames consume dates and signatures, feeling with each page a corresponding loosening inside himself. The ash that remained he scattered from the tower window, letting the mountain wind carry the fragments into the valleys where no one would recognize them. Stefan left for the university in Vienna at 19, carrying letters of introduction and a small trunk of books. The carriage departed at dawn. Victor did not descend to the courtyard. He watched from the gallery as the vehicle disappeared between the pines, then turned back to the empty house with the expression of a man who has just completed a long and necessary subtraction. Anna took to her bed that same week and did not rise again. Her final days were spent in a gentle delirium where she spoke to the boy as though he were still small enough to hold in her arms, confessing small tendernesses and larger fears in a voice that grew thinner with each hour. When she died, the priest performed the rites with unusual haste, as though eager to leave the manor before the silence could claim him too. Stefan returned for the funeral, his face composed, his mourning clothes impeccable. He and Victor stood side by side at the graveside while the wind tore at the black crepe. No words passed between them that the wind could not steal. After the mourners departed, Stefan remained for 7 days, walking the corridors, touching the furniture, reading the remaining books in the library. On the 8th morning, he informed his father that he would not return to the estate, that the sale of the timber rights and the manor itself had already been arranged through agents in the capital. Victor listened without surprise. He signed the necessary papers with a hand that no longer trembled. Stefan left at dusk. Victor stood alone in the great hall as the last light withdrew from the windows. The house settled around him with the sound of old wood remembering its trees. He moved through the rooms, extinguishing lamps one by one, each flame's death a small affirmation of the larger extinguishing already underway. In the final chamber, he sat before the cold hearth and waited for the pressure to complete its work. The mountain night pressed against the glass, patient, immense, offering neither judgment nor mercy. The manor was found empty 3 months later by a forester come to check boundary markers. No note remained, no sign of struggle. The few possessions Victor had kept were arranged with deliberate care, as though the occupant had simply stepped out for a walk from which he did not intend to return. The estate passed into other hands, was divided, resold, forgotten. Stefan taught philosophy in a small academy near the Danube, his lectures attended by students who spoke afterward of a clarity that bordered on absence. He never married. He never returned to the mountains. When he died, many years later, his papers contained no mention of the Carpathians, no reference to the name Krasnov, only a single undated fragment written in his precise hand. To be named is already to begin disappearing. And so the descent continues, not toward any shore, but deeper into the recognition that every claim to existence is a temporary truce with the void, every lineage a story told against the wind. The pressure does not end with any particular life. It is the condition of having lived at all, the slow, courteous erosion that leaves no monument, no witness, no final accounting. Only the quiet certainty that whatever we thought we were preserving was never ours to keep, and that the mountain, the river, the indifferent sky will remain long after the last name has been spoken and forgotten. In the lowlands of the Indus Delta, where the river once braided itself into 1,000 silver threads. Before the canals came and straightened everything into obedience, a birth unfolded in the monsoon summer of 1879 that would later be remembered only as the year the old Haveli of the Mirani family began its long, polite surrender to salt and tide. The house stood on a slight rise above the floodplain, its brick walls already mottled with the white efflorescence that arrives when groundwater rises too close to the foundations. Nawab Abdul Hafiz Mirani, last of a line that had once collected revenue from entire parganas, had reached 53 without a son who lived past the first fever season. His wives, 3, kept in separate wings, had each borne daughters who were married away as soon as custom permitted, leaving the central courtyard quieter with every passing year. When a youngest wife, Zainab, entered her 9th month, the household moved through its days with the careful choreography of people who fear that hope itself might frighten away the outcome they have waited for so long. The delivery came at 3 in the morning, announced not by thunder, but by the sudden silence of the frogs that usually sang through the night. The dye, summoned from a village 2 bends downstream, worked by the light of a single oil lamp and the moon that managed to pierce the cloud cover. Zainab's cries were brief, almost apologetic, as though she understood that noise might disturb the delicate balance the household had maintained for decades. When the child finally emerged, the dye lifted him into the lamplight and paused. The infant was large, vigorous, already reaching with small fists that opened and closed like someone testing the air for promises. But his skin carried a shade deeper than either parent's, a warm brown that caught the flame and held it rather than reflecting it back. The dye said nothing. She cleaned him, wrapped him in the cloth prepared months earlier, and placed him beside his mother. Zainab looked once, then turned her face to the wall. The room filled with the sound of her breathing, steady now, deliberate, as though each inhalation were an act of decision. By dawn, the household knew there would be only one child acknowledged. The second infant, a girl, smaller, quieter, arrived 20 minutes after her brother and was received into silence. The dye carried her to the far wing, where an elderly wet nurse waited, already instructed. No announcement was made. No name was given in the birthing chamber. The girl simply ceased to be part of the story the moment she drew breath. Abdul Hafiz was summoned to see his son. He stood at the foot of the bed, hands clasped behind his back, studying the wrapped bundle with the same measured attention he gave to revenue reports. He nodded once. Akil, he said, the name chosen long before from the family genealogies. Then he left without touching the child. The courtyard filled with servants carrying sweetmeats and fruit to the gates, distributing them to the village as custom required for the birth of a male heir. No one mentioned the second birth. The dye was paid double and sent away before sunrise with instructions to speak of only one child. The village accepted the gift and the silence that accompanied it. The years that followed arranged themselves around the visible sun with the geometry of a formal garden. Akil was raised in the main wing, taught Persian calligraphy before he could properly hold the reed, instructed in horsemanship on the small gray mare kept solely for his use, surrounded by tutors who arrived from Hyderabad and Multan with trunks of books and letters of impeccable lineage. His mother watched him with a devotion so complete it bordered on ritual. She measured his height against the doorframe each spring equinox, embroidered his kordas with her own hands, sang him the same qawwali her own mother had sung to her, as though repetition could imprint permanence. Abdul Hafiz, meanwhile, resumed the public life of a man who has finally secured continuity. He hosted the district collector for dinners that lasted until the servants' feet ached, negotiated new canal rights with the irrigation department, commissioned a marble tablet for the family mosque inscribed with the names of every Mirani male back to the time of the Talpers. The name Akil appeared at the bottom, freshly carved, the stones still pale against the older inscriptions. In the women's wing, however, another life unfolded in parallel, invisible except to those who already knew it existed. The girl, named quietly by the wet nurse as Noor, grew in the shadowed rooms at the rear of the Haveli. She learned to walk holding the hem of the old woman's sari, learned to speak in whispers, learned that certain doors were never to be opened and certain windows never to be looked through during daylight hours. The servants who tended her were chosen for their discretion and their lack of family in the immediate villages. They came and went by the back gate, paid in coin rather than kind, instructed never to linger in the main courtyard, nor wore plain cotton, ate the same food as the household but from a separate kitchen, slept on a charpoy in a room that had once been a storeroom for old palanquins. She was never cruelly treated. Indeed, the wet nurse and the two maids who cared for her showed a gentleness that surprised even themselves. But the gentleness had the quality of something performed in secret, like prayer in a house where religion has become optional. As Noor and Akil approached their 10th year, the difference in their worlds became a kind of silent architecture. Akil rode through the village on festival days, scattering coins to children who shouted his name. Nor watched from high Jaroka, whose lattice was kept closed except for the narrowest slits. Akil's tutors spoke of Plato and Al-Farabi, nor was taught to read the Quran by the old wet nurse, who traced the letters with her finger on the child's palm when no one else was present. Akil's portrait was painted by an artist from Karachi. The canvas later hung in the Diwan Khana, where visitors could admire the future of the Mirani name. Noor's face was never committed to paper or pigment. Yet the two children, separated by walls and custom, began to sense each other's presence the way animals sense a storm still beyond the horizon. Akil would pause sometimes in the central courtyard, looking toward the women's wing as though listening for a sound he could not name. Noor would stop mid-step in the narrow corridor, her head tilted, as though she had heard someone call her from the other side of the brick. Abdul Hafiz felt none of this. His recognition had narrowed to a single point: the boy who carried his name forward. The girl had become a technicality, an administrative detail handled by others. He no longer asked after her health, no longer required reports. She existed in the household the way a forgotten account exists in a ledger. Entered once, never crossed out, gradually buried under newer entries until only the faintest impression remains. Zainab, however, carried the knowledge like a second heartbeat. She never spoke of it, never acknowledged the existence of the second child, even in private prayer. Yet she grew thinner each year, her eyes receding into the sockets as though retreating from what they had seen. When she looked at Akil, she saw both children at once, the one she had claimed and the one she had released, and the contradiction aged her faster than malaria or childbirth ever could. By the time the children reached 16, the Haveli had begun its visible decline. The canals, so carefully negotiated, brought more water than the soil could absorb. Salt crept upward through the foundations, flaking plaster in geometric patterns that resembled cracked ice. The revenue from the lands diminished year by year. Abdul Aziz sold the last of the family elephants, then the silver howdahs, then the library of rare manuscripts. He sat in the Diwan Khana, surrounded by empty chairs, reading old sanads that granted rights no longer enforceable. Akil, now tall and quiet, had been sent to Lahore for college. He wrote letters that were dutiful but brief, mentioning examinations and cricket matches, never asking when he might return. Noor remained in the women's wing, taller now, her movements economical, her gaze steady. She had learned to read the household accounts when no one was watching, taught herself the rudiments of Urdu poetry from a tattered divan left behind by a long-dead tutor. She understood her position with perfect clarity. She was the remainder that could not be divided evenly, the figure that refused to disappear when the ledger was balanced. One night in the winter of 1895, when the fog lay so thick across the delta that the river sounded closer than it was, Noor slipped through the back gate and walked into the dark. She carried nothing but the clothes she wore and a small bundle containing the Quran the wet nurse had given her, its pages worn thin from years of tracing. She did not run. She walked with the deliberate pace of someone who has already calculated every consequence and found none worse than remaining. The village dogs barked once, then fell silent, as though recognizing that this departure belonged to a different order of events. By dawn, she had reached the railway siding where goods trains paused to take on water. A goods clerk, seeing a young woman alone, asked no questions. He simply pointed to an empty wagon bound for Karachi. nor climbed in among the sacks of rice, and sat with her back to the wall, watching the landscape slide past in shades of gray and salt white. She was never pursued. Abdul Hafiz was informed of her absence 2 days later by a servant who spoke in the careful voice of someone delivering news that might detonate. He listened without expression, then nodded once and returned to his correspondence. No search was mounted. No report was made to the Thana. The girl had never been entered into the family records, never baptized into the public life of the Maranis. Her disappearance required no explanation because her existence had never been formally conceded. Zainab, when told, closed her eyes for a long moment and then asked that fresh flowers be placed in the small mosque. She did not specify whose memory they were to honor. Akil returned from Lahore the following spring, thinner, quieter, carrying books in languages his father could no longer read. He walked through the Haveli as though measuring it for absence. He asked no questions about the empty rooms, the missing servants, the salt that now reached halfway up the walls. Abdul Hafiz died 2 years later, alone in the Diwan Khana, a half-written letter on the desk before him. Akil buried him beside the mosque, then sold the remaining land to a Bombay merchant who planned to turn it into rice fields fed by new canals. The Haveli was abandoned. Rain entered through the broken jharokas. Vines climbed the marble screens. The portrait of the young heir, once so proud, mildewed until the face became a soft blur, nor was never seen again in the Delta. Rumors drifted back years later. Someone who looked like her had been spotted teaching in a girls' school in Surat. Another claimed she had entered a Sufi khanqa near Ajmer, but nothing could be confirmed. She had stepped out of the frame the moment she left the wagon in Karachi, leaving no address, no name that could be traced. Akil lived out his life in Lahore, a minor functionary in the revenue department, meticulous, solitary, childless. When he died in 1942, the family name ended with him, as though the ledger had finally balanced itself. The Haveli still stands, half submerged in salt marsh, its walls leaning toward the river like old men listening for news that never arrives. Fishermen passing in flat-bottomed boats sometimes point to it and speak of 2 children born on the same night, one raised in light, the other erased so completely that even memory refused to hold her shape. They do not know the names. They do not need to. The story is carried not in words, but in the slow collapse of brick into mud, in the way the Indus keeps changing its course, erasing old channels, leaving behind only the faint impression of water that once flowed there and the knowledge that whatever was carried away was never truly owned, only borrowed for a season against the inevitable tide, in the iron-gray light of the winter solstice, 1911. When the Baltic froze solid from the Skerries to the open sea and the wind off the Gulf of Bothnia carried the taste of rust and pine tar. A birth took place inside the stone manor of the von Ljungberg family on the island of Oro that would quietly begin the long subtraction of their name from the world. Baron Henrik von Ljungberg, master of the last profitable sawmills and the fleet of timber barks that still carried Swedish pine to the ports of Lubeck and Riga, had returned from Stockholm only 3 days earlier, summoned by telegram that spoke only of complications. His wife, the pale and exacting Elizabeth, had waited through the long autumn alone, her body heavy with the child that doctors in Helsinki had sworn would secure the succession after 4 stillbirths and 1 daughter who had lived 9 days before the ice claimed her too. The manor stood on a granite shelf above the harbor, its walls built from the same stone that had once been quarried for the king's fortresses. Now the frost widened the cracks between the blocks each year, letting the sea air inside like a slow confession. The birth began at the hour when the sun never rose. The midwife, an old woman from the mainland who had delivered 3 generations of coastal nobility, worked by the light of whale oil lamps and the faint blue glow that seeped through the ice-glazed windows. Elizabeth made no sound beyond the measured breathing she had practiced for months. She had always believed that dignity was a form of architecture, something one could reinforce against collapse. When the first child emerged, a boy, he announced himself with a cry that rattled the crystal on the sideboard downstairs. The midwife wrapped him quickly, pronouncing him perfect, strong, the future baron. Henrik, waiting in the adjoining chamber with a glass of aquavit he did not drink, allowed himself one brief nod. Then the second child followed, smaller, quieter, entering the world without protest. Eyes already open and fixed on the ceiling as though reading the grain of the beams for some message written there long before any of them were born. His skin was the same northern milk, his hair the same fine gold. Yet something in the shape of his silence made the midwife pause. She did not speak it aloud. She simply carried him to the far side of the great bed and placed him in the arms of the youngest housemaid, who had been told in advance that only one child would be presented. By morning the household had arranged itself around the visible heir. The boy was named Gustav, after the king whose portrait hung in the great hall. Telegrams were sent to Stockholm and to distant cousins in Turku. Silver spoons were engraved. A wet nurse from the village was installed in the nursery wing, and the servants were instructed, without explanation, that any mention of a second birth would be considered an act of disloyalty to the house. The second child was given the name Elias by the housemaid, who had lost her own son to diphtheria the previous winter and saw in the quiet infant a second chance at something that could not be taken from her. He was moved to the small room above the kitchens, the one used for storing winter apples, where the smell of fruit and wood smoke would be his first memory. No baptism was recorded for him. No entry was made in the family Bible. He existed only in the spaces the other servants had been trained not to notice. The years settled over the manor like new snow that never melts. Gustav was raised in the upper rooms with tutors brought from Uppsala, taught the history of the realm as though it had been written solely for him, dressed in velvet jackets that smelled of camphor and authority. He learned to ride the small Icelandic pony kept in the stable, to speak French at table, to stand at his father's side during the annual inspection of the sawmills where the logs screamed their way into planks. Henrik watched him with the careful pride of a man balancing accounts, correcting posture, correcting speech, correcting any hint of softness. Elizabeth devoted herself to the visible son with a fervor that had the quality of atonement. She embroidered his initials on every handkerchief, read him sagas of heroic death each night, measured his growth against the doorpost with a silver knife, as though recording height could anchor him to the stone of the house. Elias, meanwhile, grew in the lower world. The housemaid, now promoted to housekeeper, taught him to read from the discarded ledgers of the mill, to carve small boats from pine scraps, to move through the manor without casting a shadow that anyone upstairs would notice. He ate in the servants' hall after the others had finished, slept on a narrow cot beneath the eaves where the wind found every gap. He never complained. He never asked why the boy who rode past the kitchen window each morning looked exactly like the reflection he saw in the copper pots. He simply observed, with the same open, unblinking gaze he had shown at birth, the way the household revolved around a single center while he orbited at the edge, invisible yet necessary, like the keystone no one ever mentions until the arch begins to sag. By the time the boys reached 12, the subtraction had begun inside the family itself. Henrik found himself pausing at the top of the stairs, listening for a second set of footsteps that never came, then continuing downward with a heavier tread. Elizabeth's hands, once so precise, began to tremble when she signed the household books. She would stare at the single column of figures for Gustav and feel the absence of the other column like a missing tooth. The servants moved more quietly, as though noise might wake something that had been deliberately put to sleep. The manor itself seemed to lean, the cracks in the foundation widening each spring when the ice broke and the sea gnawed at the rock below. Timber shipments were delayed by storms that had no right to be so violent. Contracts in Stockholm were lost in the post. The sawmills ran at half capacity, the workers whispering that the Baron's luck had turned the year the second child was never spoken of. Gustav, the acknowledged son, began to falter in ways no tutor could correct. He would stand at the window for hours watching the harbor, his reflection growing thinner in the glass. He spoke less, laughed less, as though some essential part of him had been loaned out and never returned. Elias, in the kitchen world, grew taller, steadier, his hands learning the grain of wood so well that the carpenters began to seek his opinion on repairs no one upstairs noticed. The two boys never met formally. Yet they passed each other in corridors at dusk, eyes meeting for the length of a held breath before one continued upward and the other downward. No word was ever exchanged. The silence between them was the truest conversation in the house. In the winter of 1924, when Gustav turned 13, Henrik made the decision that had been waiting since the night of the birth. He summoned the housekeeper and instructed her to prepare Elias for travel. The boy would be sent to a distant relative in Umeå, presented as an orphan from a branch of the family no one remembered. There would be money for his keep, but no letters, no visits, no name. Elizabeth did not protest. She sat in the blue salon with her hands folded, staring at the portrait of Gustav alone, and nodded once when her husband asked if she understood. Gustav was told only that a servant's child was leaving. He asked no questions, as though he had already guessed the shape of the absence. Elias left at dawn on a sledge, pulled by two black horses whose breath froze in white plumes. He carried nothing but the clothes he wore and a small pine boat he had carved himself. The housekeeper wept silently into her shawl. Henrik watched from a tower window until the sledge disappeared between the snow-laden pines. Then he turned back to the empty rooms and felt, for the first time, the full weight of what he had removed. Not a child, but a portion of reality itself. The manor did not survive the subtraction. Within 3 years, the sawmills closed. Henrik sold the barks one by one, then the furniture, then the land itself to a consortium from Helsinki that cared nothing for lineage. Elizabeth took to her bed in the spring of 1928 and never rose again. The doctors called it a wasting, but those who had lived in the house knew it was simply the final accounting. Gustav, now the last von Ljungberg, inherited nothing but debts and the silence that had replaced his name. He left for Stockholm at 19, took a clerk's position in a shipping office, and was never heard from again. When he died in a boarding house in 1947, the landlady found no papers, no photographs, only a small pine boat on the windowsill, its paint long since worn away by years of handling. The manor still stands on its granite shelf, though the sea has claimed half the foundation and the roof has fallen in. Fishermen passing in summer speak sometimes of two boys born on the same night, one raised to inherit the world, and the other erased so completely that even the wind no longer carries his name. They do not know which one truly vanished. They do not need to. The ice returns each year. The cracks widen, the stone settles deeper into the cold water, and the subtraction continues, slow, courteous, inevitable, until the last beam gives way and the entire structure slides without sound into the gray Baltic, leaving only the flat surface of the sea and the knowledge that every name we carve in the world is written on water, every lineage a temporary refusal of the dark that was waiting, open-eyed and patient, from the first breath we chose to acknowledge, and the one we did not I in the thin, metallic dawn of a February morning in 1963, when the harmattan wind carried red dust across the savannah, and the harmattan turned every shadow into something that looked already half eroded. A birth occurred in the old colonial bungalow on the outskirts of Zaria that would quietly complete the long, courteous unmaking of the name that had once claimed to own the land itself. Major General, retired, Alistair McCready, last of the McCready line that had arrived with the first punitive expeditions and stayed to plant tea, rubber, and the idea of permanence, had lived alone in the house since his wife's death from blackwater fever in 1948. The bungalow stood on a low hill above the Kaduna Road, its whitewashed walls streaked with laterite, its tin roof rusting in perfect symmetry with the hibiscus hedges that had long since stopped being trimmed. He had no children, no acknowledged heirs. The few distant cousins in Edinburgh sent polite Christmas cards that he never answered. Yet in the final year of his life, a woman from the nearby village, Fatima, who had come to the house first as a laundress and later as something the servants never named aloud, bore him twin sons in the back bedroom, where the ceiling fan turned with the slow inevitability of a pendulum counting down. The birth was attended only by the village midwife and one of the older houseboys who had served the major since the days of the groundnut scheme. No doctor was summoned from the mission hospital. No announcement was made to the district officer or the club in Kaduna. When the first child emerged, strong-lunged and fair enough to pass for European in the dim light, the midwife lifted him toward the major who stood in the doorway in his faded dressing gown. Alistair looked once, nodded, and said the name he had chosen years earlier in case such a thing ever happened. Duncan. The second child followed minutes later, smaller, darker, silent where his brother had cried. The midwife wrapped him without ceremony and carried him to the far end of the house, to the small room once used for storing mosquito nets and quinine. No name was spoken for him then. The major never asked to see him. The houseboy was told to find a wet nurse among the village women and to keep the matter contained within the compound walls. By noon, the servants had already begun referring to the boy and the other one, as though the distinction had always existed. Duncan was raised in the front rooms with the ceremony appropriate to an only son. He slept beneath a mosquito net embroidered with his initials, ate at the dining table with silver cutlery that had crossed oceans, was taught by a retired colonial schoolmaster brought up from Jos to drill him in Latin, Euclid, and the correct pronunciation of received pronunciation. The major watched him with the dispassionate attention of a man inspecting a plantation for yield, posture, diction, the angle at which a fork should be held. He told stories of the regiment, of campaigns along the Bainway, of the day the flag came down in '60 and he had saluted it alone on the parade ground. Duncan listened, wide-eyed, believing every word, believing himself the sole inheritor of that history. Fatima, his mother, was allowed to visit the nursery only when the major was away on one of his increasingly rare trips to Lagos. She would sit beside the cot in silence, her hands folded, never quite touching the child who carried her features in the curve of the jaw and the set of the eyes, but who would never know her name. The other boy, called simply Musa by the wet nurse who raised him, was kept in the servants' quarters at the rear. He learned to walk on the cracked concrete of the yard where the laundry was hung, learned to speak Hausa before English, learned that certain doors were never to be opened and certain questions never to be asked. The servants fed him, clothed him in hand-me-downs, taught him small tasks, carrying water, sweeping the verandas after dark, so that his presence could be explained as the son of one of the women. He grew taller than expected, quieter than expected, his skin the deep brown of laterite after rain. He never saw his brother except in glimpses. Duncan riding the old pony along the drive, Duncan playing cricket against the wall with a ball made of wound string, Duncan standing at attention while the major inspected his fingernails. Musa watched from behind the hibiscus, unseen, unremarked, the way one watches weather move across a distant plain. By the time the boys reached 10, the major's health had begun its slow, orderly retreat. Malaria returned each rainy season, each bout leaving him thinner, paler, more precise in his movements as though conserving what little strength remained. He spent hours on the veranda staring at the savannah, a glass of warm gin in his hand, murmuring regimental songs under his breath. Duncan sat beside him, reading aloud from Kipling or Buchan, his voice cracking as adolescence approached. Musa, meanwhile, had been taught to read by the cook's son using old newspapers and a tattered Bible. He worked in the garden, learned the names of plants in 3 languages, and began to understand that his life was measured not in years, but in the distance he was permitted to keep from the main house. In the spring of 1973, the major suffered a stroke that left the right side of his face slack and his speech slurred, but his mind intact. He summoned the district officer, now an elderly Nigerian civil servant who had once been his clerk, and made the will. Everything, the bungalow, the small pension, the few acres of cleared land, went to Duncan. There was no mention of a second son. The document was witnessed by the cook and the gardener, both of whom had known Musa since infancy, but signed without comment. That night the major called Fatima to his room. She stood at the foot of the bed while he spoke in a voice that no longer carried across parade grounds. "Take the other one," he said. "Take him away. I won't have questions asked after I'm gone." She nodded once. "No tears, no protest." She had waited decades for this permission to claim what had always been hers. Musa left before first light, walking beside his mother along the red laterite road that led to the village. He carried nothing but the clothes he wore and a small cloth bundle containing the Bible he had read until the pages separated. Duncan slept through the departure. The major died 3 weeks later, alone in the bedroom, with the ceiling fan turning above him. The funeral was small, attended by a handful of retired officers who had driven up from Kaduna and a few villagers who remembered when the bungalow had flown the Union Jack. Duncan stood at the graveside in a black suit that had belonged to his father, his face composed, his eyes dry. After the burial, he returned to the house, walked through the empty rooms, and felt, for the first time, the precise shape of what had been subtracted. Not a brother, not a rival, simply the other half of the mirror he had never been allowed to look into. The bungalow passed to Duncan, who sold it within the year to a Lebanese trader who turned it into a small hotel for truck drivers on the Lagos-Kano route. The new owner painted over the old nameplate, knocked down the servants' quarters to make room for parking, and never asked about the boy who had once swept the verandas after dark. Duncan moved to Abuja, took a position in the new civil service, married a woman from Enugu, had 2 daughters who would never hear the name McCready spoken except as a footnote in someone else's history. He died in 2001, quietly, of heart failure, leaving no letters, no journals, no unanswered questions. Musa walked out of the story the morning he left the bungalow. He reached Kano by lorry, then Kaduna, then, through a series of small, unrecorded movements, Lagos. He found work as a mechanic, then as a driver, then as a clerk in a shipping office near the docks. He married, had sons, taught them Hausa and Yoruba and the little English he remembered for newspapers. He never spoke of the white man in the big house or the brother he had glimpsed through hibiscus leaves. When he died in 1998, his children buried him in a small cemetery near Apapa. His grave has no marker now. The headstone cracked in the rains of 2004 and was never replaced. The bungalow still stands, though the tin roof is gone and the walls have returned to the color of the earth they were built from. Travelers on the Kaduna Road sometimes notice it, half swallowed by bougainvillea and mango trees that have grown wild. They speak, if they speak of it at all, of a house where 2 boys were born on the same night. One raised to carry a name across borders and decades, the other released into the vastness of the country so completely that even memory could not hold his shape. No one knows the names anymore. No one needs to. The wind still carries red dust across the savannah. The harmattan still blurs the horizon, and the subtraction completes itself. Not with drama, not with revelation, but with the slow, patient work of time that erases every claim, every lineage, every distinction we thought we could defend against the indifferent earth. What remains is only the flat red road, the turning fan in an empty room, and the quiet certainty that whatever we tried to preserve was always borrowed against a debt that comes due without announcement, without mercy, without remainder.